Whatever your views are on demons or evil spirits, I just want to invite you to stick with us today and actually over the next 4 weeks in a new series that we're jumping into that we've entitled Invisible War. And for the next 4 weeks, we're going to unpack some of what God actually has to say about this whole thing of this battle that's raging around us. He says, look, let me tell you what's going on in the world. And so this is what he actually says. He says, look, there's more going on around us than meets the eye. God says, what you think you see and what you think is going on, he said, there's so much more going on. You can't even begin to imagine all that's happening around us. It's not about what we see. It's not about who we can touch or feel or hear, but instead it's against evil rulers, authorities of the unseen world, mighty powers of the dark world, evil spirits in heavenly places. And bottom line, you say, man, what in the world is going on? And God says, look, I'm telling you what's going on. There's an invisible war that's happening all around us. As I'm talking about evil spirits or things like that even right now, it elicits an array of responses, usually several extremes. On one extreme, some of you may hear me say that and you say, you know what, David, I don't think that's for real. You can talk about evil spirits, you can talk about demons, but when it comes to that, I don't really believe that it's real. And when God talks about it, he's just using very symbolic language for the evil things that happen in the world, but it's not real, it's not really true. It's no different than the boogeyman living in the closet of my bedroom when I was a kid or a monster underneath my bed. It's just not real. The other side, an extreme response to it all, is for those who would say, oh man, when it comes to demons or evil spirits, they're everywhere. And everything bad that happens, it's all tied back to these evil demons, these evil spirits. They're all over the place. And just the smallest little trip up and oh yeah, that's what's causing it. It's the demons and evil spirits that are everywhere. And so it's one of two extremes. Or then there are those that are in the middle. And those in the middle, maybe the rest of us, we just kind of sit back and say, David, talking about demons and evil spirits, that's just weird. It's just strange. It's not something that I'm used to. It's not something I even want to talk about. But can I just say to you, God says, you know what? Demons are real. Evil spirits are real. My goal in this series isn't to try to frighten you. My goal in this series isn't just to give you information. Instead, my goal in this series is to say that you and I, we need to be prepared for the battle. It's going on around us, so we need to be aware, but more than aware, we need to be prepared. And you say, why do we need to be prepared? Well, the reason we need to be prepared is it's real. The enemy that we're facing, it's real. This isn't just a game. This isn't just kind of this symbolic word that God is giving. He's saying there really exists this vicious, supernatural enemy, and it's very real. It's not just a few characters running around in red tights with little horns and a pointed tail and a pitchfork trying to scare people. This is something that's real, and it's not a game. Some things we know about these evil spirits, these demons, just real fast that I'll tell you, they're numerous. There's a lot of them. It's not just a few, not just a handful, but they're numerous. Not only are they numerous, but they're powerful. More powerful than you, more powerful than me. Not only numerous and powerful, but they're wicked, and they're also described as being incredibly clever. And so you say, this is the enemy that we're up against. This is the enemy that we face. And like it or not, the enemy is real. Like it or not, the battle is real as well. It's this invisible war, but it's happening nonetheless. And here's the mistake that we often make. And it's a mistake that's been made throughout history. And the mistake is we think our battle is against other human beings. We think our battle is against each other, against human beings. And so throughout history, there's been this tendency to focus our energy and our attacks on other human beings. And so we make the mistake of thinking, oh, it's the government, it's these rogue governments around the world, they're the enemy, or we lash out at people that oppose us. But Paul says the enemy, it's not visible, it's not relatively weak human beings, it's not even what we would think are powerful human authorities. Instead, he said, it's in the heavenly realms, and therefore it's unseen. And so let me just say to you real specifically, the enemy, it's not your wife. The enemy, it's not your husband. The enemy, it's not the bully that sits across from you in homeroom. It's not your boss. It's not Muslims. It's not ISIS. It's not even shooters like the one in Las Vegas. Your problem, my problems are deeper than flesh and blood. How is this invisible war going to affect me? Is it going to affect you specifically? And bottom line, in addition to fighting for God's plan of putting everything under the authority of Jesus, the enemy is also have a goal against you and me. And the goal for you and me is to kind of frustrate God's plan for me, frustrate God's plan for you, to somehow knock us off track in our relationship with God. And if we believe that God has a plan for each and every one of us, and I sincerely believe that, God has a plan for you, and he has a plan for me in my life. And if the enemy can come and just frustrate that plan, if the enemy can come and just knock us off track in our relationship with Jesus, then all of a sudden the enemy feels successful. And God has a plan. It's that every knee will bow before Jesus. And there's a desire by the enemy to thwart that plan. There's a desire by the enemy to just frustrate whatever plans God may have for you and me. Stay alert. Watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour, like a roaring lion. And so we're told, be careful, because we have this enemy that's like a roaring lion, just waiting to devour us. And the impression is that there's an enemy that's there and it's waiting, he's watching you and he's watching me and just ready to take us down. And doing, I think, the same thing the roaring lion does, waiting for a moment of weakness, waiting for a moment for us to be separated off by ourselves, waiting for a moment where we're tired and we're just weary, waiting for a moment where we're distracted, where we think everything is fine and there's no danger lurking, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in trouble. And so if our enemy is like a prowling, roaring lion waiting to devour us, I just want to give you some places where you and I tend to oftentimes have weaknesses, where we find ourselves susceptible to being attacked. So first one I give you, this was discouragement. When we find ourselves discouraged, in that moment of weakness where I'm down, where I'm just thinking, I'm not good enough, just that crack, that open window of discouragement, maybe that moment where the roaring lion jumps in and pounces on us, when we find ourselves saying, you know what, I just don't know if I'm good enough to do this. I don't know that I'm capable. And all of a sudden, the enemy jumps in and he says, you're right, you're not good enough. You're not good enough to be loved by God. Are you kidding me? I mean, look at what you were like back in high school and college when you were younger. Don't you remember? Don't you remember what you were like just last week in talking with your wife and your kids? Oh, you're not good enough to measure up to God's standards. Don't you remember what you did on that business trip? You're not good enough. And the window's cracked for just a little bit of discouragement. You can't handle that job. You don't even have the right education to be in that position. You'll never make it alone. You better give in to whatever he wants from you, because if you don't do what he says, you're going to end up alone, and you'll be alone the rest of your life. And all of a sudden, you find yourself deep, deep into discouragement. It's just a crack, just a window, and the enemy attacks. And discouragement, when you say, I'm just not good enough. Or a second way that oftentimes we find ourselves in a moment of weakness is one of discontentment, where we think it's not good enough. The things around me aren't good enough, where we're vulnerable because we're dissatisfied and discontent with the things around us. And this job, this crummy job that I have, it's not good enough. And my husband, that lowlife, he's not good enough. And this car, the car that I have, it doesn't measure up to what all of my friends are driving. Or this house is so small, it's an embarrassment to me. And you expect me to wear that same outfit another time? And all of a sudden, just a little crack, discontent, and it's just not good enough. And the enemy jumps in, and we're caught in this trap of comparisons, and nothing in your life is good enough anymore. And the enemy pounces on it like a roaring lion, and we find ourselves deep in trouble. Discouragement, discontent. Let me give one other, and this one I think is new in the last 20 years or so. This is actually one of distraction, where I get confused between what's good and what's actually the very best. And all of a sudden, I'm pursuing things that are good but not the best, and good ends up being a moment of weakness, and all of a sudden, the enemy jumps in and pounces. What you need to know is there's really no reason for a Christian to live their life in fear of the enemy. No reason for it. In spite of the power of the enemy, we're not at a disadvantage. And so these are things that are going to just encourage you as we go forward, as you go forward, as our world just... When you find yourself saying, what in the world is going on? Then I think these are some things that you're going to want to remember. The first thing I would just encourage you with is God is greater than our enemy. God is greater than our enemy. We sang about that today. We just sang about, God, you are a strong God. God is greater than our enemy. 1 John chapter 4, verse 4 actually says this, but you, meaning you and me, Those of us that are followers of Jesus Christ, you and I belong to God, my dear children. We're his sons, we're his daughters. You've already won a victory because the Spirit who lives in you is greater than the spirit that lives in the world. Second thing for encouragement, the enemy is already defeated. It's done. The enemy is already defeated. We sang about that today as well. The cross has the final word. And at the cross, the enemy was defeated. You and I belong to the victor. And he, the victor, is far above any other ruler or authority, any other power, anything else. Not just in this physical world, but in the world that's unseen as well. So yeah, there's a battle raging around us, but we have hope. And while the enemy wants to discourage us, and it catches us in moments of weakness and discouragement, Jesus steps in and says, let me give you hope in the midst of that discouragement. The enemy comes in times of discontent or times where we're distracted and confused and just flustered, and Jesus steps in and says, let me give you a peace in the midst of this. And here's some things just to remember. When you know who your enemy is, you will not take him lightly. And again, we can't take the enemy lightly. This is real. It's powerful. It's real. Beyond that, when you take up God's armor, you're ready to enter the battle. And so you and I, we don't have to be defenseless. You and I don't have to be caught off guard, but we can be ready to fight the battle. When you fight in God's strength, you will not be defeated. We won't. You and I can be victorious. Focus on Jesus, the one who makes the darkness tremble.